Warning, I will spoil large parts of the game in this video, basically the entire story. I fully recommend playing through it before you continue to watch. In 2011, a black and white silent film called The Artist, written and directed by Michel Hazanaviciu starring Jean Dujardin and Berenice Bejo, was released to great acclaim by the vast majority of critics. If one reads about the movie, they will constantly see words like nostalgic, timeless and tribute thrown around by its proponents. It even won the Oscar for Best Picture that year, plus several other awards and nominations. The only problem being that the vast majority of consumers, cinephiles, where I fit in, and to be fair, some of the more sensible critics hated it. And I mean we despised it. Why? Because The Artist is not a film about some inner part of the author's mind or even for the audience's enjoyment. No, this is the worst kind of film, a film for the critics. It is an opportunity for them to wax poetic about the things that have been said a million times over so they can flaunt memorized platitudes. There is a difference between a hollow replica that tries to ape its influence to a T and genuine tributes that transform cliches into something fresh, like how Spielberg and Lucas took the old Safari Alan Quatermain style stories and made Indiana Jones, or how almost all of Tarantino's body of work consists of carefully balancing the kitschy and pulpy influences of his youth with genuine cinematic insight. Now some of you might be wondering why I'm mentioning this in a game critique video. Well, in these past 4 months since Obsidian's Pillars of Eternity was released, I couldn't help but see the exact same situation unfold before my very eyes. Pillars of Eternity is an isometric role-playing game in a generic fantasy world featuring real-time with pause combat where the player controls a party of up to 6 characters that must brave all sorts of situations, mostly related to killing things. This basically describes all Infinity Engine products, a series of 5 games and their expansions which were made in the same engine and are considered by quite a few people, especially old-school gamers, to be the pinnacle of computer role-playing games. Now for those of you who don't know, Obsidian is one of the best RPG-focused development studios in the world, and in 2011 they had a Kickstarter to raise money through crowdfunding, so they could make their passion project, Pillars of Eternity, without publisher influence, a game that wanted to pay tribute to the Infinity Engine style of games. But just like in the case of The Artist, what we are dealing with here is a soulless replica rather than a transformative tribute. Before I start, I think it is important to put things into perspective and say that I'm not the biggest fan of the Baldur's Gate franchise. I enjoy my time with both games, but they wouldn't make it on a top 10 list of my favorite RPGs. So when I compare the two, please keep in mind it is because Obsidian set out to make a spiritual successor, not because I have some inherent bias towards one or the other. First off, I want to talk about the places where I only have positive criticism. The 2D backgrounds look gorgeous. Sure, the models aren't spectacular and the texture quality isn't perfect if you zoom in, but these types of games aren't designed to be played at the closest zoom distance. The people at Obsidian in charge of these backgrounds deserve all the applause. I'm even willing to say that this might be one of the best looking isometric games I've ever played. Not the best, mind you, that honor goes to Transistor, but definitely a top 5 contender. Also, the game is quite stable from a technical perspective, which is amazing for an RPG. Of course there are some issues here and there, but most of the ones I experienced were hopefully fixed. The game has had several patches and more seem to be on the way. I am so happy that this developer is finally starting to cleanse the stigma of unfinished and unpolished products with stable game launches like South Park, The Stick of Truth and Pillars of Eternity, because I do remember the launch days of Obsidian games like Alpha Protocol or Fallout New Vegas, and those were dark days indeed. Beyond that, the music and sound design does its job well. Everything sounds the way it should mostly, and the soundtracks are highly reminiscent of the Infinity Engine games without flat out plagiarizing. But now on to more ambivalent things. There are many discussions on the internet of what the definition of a role-playing video game is, so for the purpose of this critique I will split it into world building, writing and combat systems, which I believe encompasses the scope of this game well. So then, world building. The game takes place in a medieval high fantasy world called Eora, and if you have read anything Tolkien related, I don't think I need to say a lot more. Honestly, the game is basically the Dungeons and Dragons pen and paper setting Forgotten Realms with the names mostly changed. You have humans, elves, dwarves, a diminutive race called Orlans which obviously take the place of gnomes/halflings, and the Amanua which are sensible aquatic orcs. The only borderline interesting race are the godlike, which means people born with all sorts of crazy magical appendages and marks that reflect that they were touched by the gods, though Pillars of Eternity doesn't do anywhere near enough to acknowledge this obviously spiritually charged background. As for locations, the game takes place in a region called the Deerwood, which is a mismatch of anachronistic influences. The story of this place is very much a callback to the New World Old World historical scenario. An empire called Ether first settled this region and fought with the technologically backwards natives until the colonists declared independence from the mainland and established their own nation. Sound familiar? The issue though is that the society depicted in this game is very much one of Arthurian legend with primitive European guns that stick out like a sore thumb. Firearms indicate a certain level of of technological and societal change that isn't in this game. I know this seems inconsequential, and Obsidian most likely just wanted people in full plate armor equipped with tower shields and long swords next to people with a pistol or a blunderbuss for the coolness factor, but this lack of attention to detail and general careless approach to influences reflects the entirety of the world building aspect of Pillars of Eternity. In this way, it is the polar opposite of Arcanum, a game whose whole concept was based around a mix of medieval and industrial influences, and it tackles this discrepancy head on. But let us be fair, this isn't the first game which is set in an uninspired setting, and I wouldn't mind so much if they weren't so pretentious about it. Like I mentioned before, there are so many things which have their names changed from their Dungeons and Dragons counterparts just to pretend they are any different. This is acceptable when they mash up concepts like Vifrax are Ethercaps plus Illithids, but I find it highly patronizing when they're the exact same things. Xaurips are exactly like kobolds, a diminutive reptilian race that worships and serves dragons. Or Delumguns are exactly like Spriggans, a forest spirit with a tree body. They almost have the exact same name. Look, most of the changed names aren't even copyrighted, they are universal mythological beings. This honestly feels like a shallow attempt to stand out from the crowd. My favorite example, which is almost laughable, is the counterpart of the vampire, which is called a vampire. Truly, Obsidian showed their master storytelling skills when creating this creature. Just call them what they are if you are using well-established concepts. There is no need from a world-building perspective to call a wheel anything other than a wheel. We all know what it is. And since I mentioned them, the Legacy of Cain series has probably one of the most interesting stories and worlds regarding vampires and their mythos, but they are still called vampires throughout the series. It doesn't insult the audience by making some name that reads more like a pun. But with all that being said, is there anything that can be regarded as original in Pillars of Eternity? Well, yes and no. You see, the world of Eora has these large green rock formations called Adra all over the place, which facilitate the flow of souls throughout the world. Basically, when someone dies, their soul goes through the Adra to the center of the world where they await reincarnation. This is very important because soul manipulation, which is called animancy, is central to the story and the way the world is built. Animancers can tell you of your past lives, find your soulmate, and even cure mental illness. The problem? Well, much in the same way that creature names are changed but function the same as their inspiration. The whole soul paradigm falls under the functionality of traditional magic and traditional quests. For example, there is an order of knights that have hereditary soul requirements rather than hereditary blood ones. And there is a quest related to this, but it is still a quest about chasing a piece of paper that proves such a link. What made it special by being related to a person's soul? Every single quest in this game relating to animancy could just as easily fall under the purview of necromancy in any other high fantasy game. And what is amusing is that Pillars of Eternity rails against this. It declares that animancy is not magic but a science. But at the same time, it doesn't really explain how it works. Is it a hidden talent? Is it a trained skill? How does one move a soul around? How does one sense it? All these questions and more shall not be answered by Pillars of Eternity in either dialogue or in-game books. The most we get is that copper and Adra are the most important materials in animantic research, and that machines that affect souls can be created. But with all that being said, show any person who hasn't played the game a scene with animancy at work and they will most likely say it's magic. The game's denial of this is hollow. There is nothing scientific about this. Oh, and I should also mention that the game tries to create this is animancy good or bad situation that unfortunately falls flat on its face, because almost all the animancers you encounter are hilariously incompetent or downright Disney evil. But by far, my biggest gripe with the game in regards to world building is the fact that most of it is done through some of the most boring and sterile dialogue I've seen in an RPG in a long while. You must be prepared for the vast majority of characters to dump mountains of text on you that mostly read like Wikipedia entries about the world. Dialogue box upon dialogue box about religion, geography, flora, fauna, etc. Now most of you will counter by saying, isn't this exactly what world building is about? No, not at all. Firstly, nobody talks like this in real life. I'm from Romania, the city of Bucharest to be specific, and if you asked me to tell you about my city, I wouldn't say, oh yes, it was founded 6 centuries ago by a guy called Bucur, but it only became the capital 2 centuries ago, and so on and so forth. No, I would say it has 6 districts and the most important stuff is in the center. Where do you wanna go? I can't stress enough how many characters and even about half of your companions in these games are just vehicles to essentially deliver what can be best described as lore porn. And beyond that, there is a huge imbalance between active lore and passive lore. What do I mean by this exactly? Well, active lore can be best described as background information regarding people and locations that the player will encounter during the game, while passive lore can be described as information about the world that doesn't necessarily help the player, but it does provide texture and believability to the created world. Pillars of Eternity goes hard towards passive lore to the point of absurdity. I realized this when halfway through the game I paused and checked the world map only to notice a large town called Twin Elves that I didn't know anything about. I then checked my journal, I checked my books, nothing. I knew more about the entire world than the city next door, one that I will obviously go to. To make a player care about the world at large, you need to make him care about the world around him. World building means more than just writing the Encyclopedia Eora and then trying to shove as much of it as possible inside the game. Rigorous internal universe consistency means nothing without proper delivery. And maybe I would have been more lenient about this if it wasn't so damn generic. I mean, Place Game Torment, another Infinity Engine game, suffers from this issue to a lesser degree, but I was much more understanding because the world, or universe rather, was so damn weird, and I wanted to know more about it. That game was also held by some stellar dialogue and exposition, which this game sadly lacks. And thus I think it is time to move on to talking about the writing in Pillars of Eternity. The main plot can be basically summarized like this. Have you played BioWare's original Neverwinter Nights campaign? Because it is almost the same plot. An evil, secretive cult led by a fanatic man uses some sort of magical affliction to steal souls from the population which are used to feed an ancient female goddess. I will concede that the Hollowborn issue, which is the epidemic of babies being born without souls and thus essentially stillborn, is more interesting than the Wailing Death, but honestly the major difference between the two plots is your personal stake in the story. In Neverwinter it is Arabeth's fate, while in Pillars it is your own endangered fate. The game begins with you traveling with a caravan for reasons established by your character's background, and after a series of unfortunate events involving a magical wind called a Beowig, which is never relevant again beyond introduction, you become a Watcher, a person capable of talking to souls. With only the image of a cult leader in your mind that was there when you awakened, you go on a journey to find him and your fate. That sounds all well and good until you realize that all of the character development takes place in the first and last hour of this game. It is played in the most straight and boring way possible, and this might have been okay if the finale had a decent payoff. To sum it all up quickly, the bad guys are a cult named the Leaden Key, headed by a man called Theos, who has the ability to reincarnate with his memories intact, essentially making him quasi-immortal. This cult wants the population to never question the gods and thus want to destroy animancy since they believe it encroaches on divine domain. Millennia ago, one of your previous lives used to be part of this cult and you did some very bad things like befriending a heretical prophet that claimed that the gods were fake and then betraying her. This being followed by your own conflict with Theos about what the prophet said, and thus results the unresolved issue that is the catalyst of your revival. This troubled past life is the reason for your Watcher awakening. So during your journey you find out that indeed the gods are some sort of magical constructs rather than omnipotent beings, and that Theos is using ancient devices to steal souls from newborns so he can empower a rebellious goddess named Wodica, which wants to control humanity, since the other gods aren't so tyrannical and they cast this particular goddess down in the past for her power lust. In the end, you confront Theos and defeat him, which leads you to the game-ending decision of what to do with the various captured souls. Now, it doesn't sound like such a bad story, but even minor inspection reveals just how lazy or careless Obsidian was. For example, your character's past life must have been mentally retarded, and I'm not being disingenuous when I say that. All game long, you are told that you need to find Theos and make him tell you his secret, which is that the gods are false, to calm your restless soul. But just before the final confrontation, you have a flashback where you see that he basically confirmed what you wanted to know without actually saying yes or no. So why are you troubled in the first place? I mean, he even says that he gave you the answers all that time ago. What more do you need?
I answered your questions once. That your soul is not fit to accept the answers is of little concern to me. I lied to no one. Not to you, not to anyone. The gods are real. They are everything we need them to be, and the world is better for it.
Anyway, in pure video game fashion you kill him and that makes you feel all better by the end. So much for personal investment in the story, but what about the philosophical side of things? Mainly, the gods are fake theme. Well, this would work except for the fact that the gods aren't really fake as much as they're not omnipotent. You see, an ancient race called Engwithans, to which your previous life and Theos belonged to, mastered animancy and using their immense powers created godlike beings to regulate the fates of man on the basis of the tired old Dostoevsky platitude. If God does not exist, everything is permitted. It is hinted that Theos caused the downfall of his civilization and countless others so none can challenge the gods, his belief being that this is the only way to maintain civilized society. This premise has a series of glaring issues. First and foremost, with the exception of the rebellious goddess Wodica, the other divine beings are varying degrees of accepting towards animancy, and this means that they are okay with the lower races surpassing them at some point. Whale, the god of knowledge, even wants this to occur.
The clash of ideas, the search for answers and meaning. These are other hunts.
This is the destiny of Kith, to struggle and transform, even through animancy.
And to improve. Steady labor and earnest industry elevate Kith above Wilder and Beast. It is also useful that they should learn to improve their souls, whether through struggle, transformation, or labor. On this, at least, we have no disagreement.
It is sort of pointless for Theos to be so pro-religious when the gods themselves are accepting of the fact that the methods of their creation will eventually be discovered at some point. But I don't think that this matters since, while they're not omnipotent, they still possess immense magical powers that they use to help their faithful. I mean, the Greek pantheon wasn't all-powerful and the gods there were full of human flaws, but they were still worshipped. I just don't see how the world of Eora will be turned on its head if someone reveals to the population. The gods aren't divine but rather magical creatures with powers far beyond our comprehension that shall help us if we worship them. So basically still gods. This premise isn't held by the fact that one of the gods dies at some point and another one even turns himself into a golem. So when you factor in the possibility of divine death in this cosmology, it seems even less likely that people will turn into savages if they find out that their objects of worship aren't timeless. A lot of what I talked about here is set dressing. Important set dressing, but nonetheless. What about the hook, the draw of the game, namely the Watcher ability? The coming back from the dead and seeing spirits concept isn't exactly novel, multiple cultures have done this sort of narrative before, but it isn't that widely used so it can make for an interesting story. There are two issues here though. First is that this ability is mostly just used as a replacement for other traditional genre tropes. For example, you enter the sewers and find a corpse. In any other RPG you would find a note and thus start a quest. In Pillars you can use your Watcher ability to see the person's last moments before death and start a quest that way. It's okay as a bit of narrative layering to make the game more interesting, but I see so much wasted potential. Every instance of this ability is scripted, and they aren't even dependent on your stats the same way your visions and reasoning are affected by your wisdom in Placegame Torment, the obvious inspiration for this style of storytelling. You do get some subpar and borderline meaningless abilities in the same way your character in the Baldur's Gate saga would, but it is fluff more than anything else. To be honest, I only recall two situations where you actually had a choice regarding your Watcher powers and they weren't just used as another opportunity for the writers to shove more lore in your face, because you can never have enough lore now, can you? And the second issue is the way people react to your evolving Watcher powers. You start doing more than just watching. You can modify behavior in people without them noticing, you can bind spirits to locations, and you can completely disintegrate people's souls, thus removing them from the process of reincarnation. And yet people treat Watchers as seers and oracles. The game world ignores the more active part of your powers. And you would think, given the cosmology and religion centered around rebirth, that such a person would be regarded with disgust and disdain everywhere. They would be feared and hunted down since they possess the ability to kill someone off technically for all time. The whole thing just reeks of laziness and lack of foresight in my opinion. They wanted to ape Planescape Torment's style of narrative delivery without fully thinking it through. Since I'm talking about the writing, I guess I should mention the stat checks as well. Here's a little tip for you. 80% of all special dialogue options are useless. The attribute-based dialogue options are generally the ones that have any effect, especially resolve. The rest, meaning your background, race, and even skills most of the time, are just used to write more descriptions, or to point out something painfully obvious that you would have gotten anyway. And this is so evident from the dialogue and the way that the quests unfold. Like when you search for a person through an item of his and all you get for your skill checks are lackluster details about the next location which you're going to find anyway because exploration is important to this game. Or when you go and talk to the tribes of Twin Elms and you use your lore skill to know information that you would have received from the speaker in the very next paragraph. I know this sounds nitpicky, but it really is not. If I was trying to be nitpicky, I would go for some very minor oversights, like the fact that at the start of the game you are asked if you have any children, and there is no godlike option for I am sterile, thus I have never sired nor will sire any offspring. It is okay, I understand. Some things fall through the gap of development, but the way that the illusion of choice is immediately shattered in this game without any payoff is just off-putting. Here is the biggest offender, which is just inexcusable for someone of Obsidian's caliber. During Act 2, you must investigate various situations related to animancy and then align yourself with a faction to gain access to the Duke of the largest city on the map, Defiance Bay. The factions are pretty badly done. You have a generic evil crime family that will do anything for money, you have a rabble called the Dozens that on multiple occasions showed they will kill anyone to get their way, and you have the Crucible Knights, which are mostly ineffectual but hey, not so murderous. So the setup isn't good. What about the payoff? Well, after gaining support, you go to the Duke and the hearing regarding what should be done about the Hollowborn Plague and Animancy. And it is here that you can make all sorts of skill checks and give an impassioned speech about what you believe in, only for Theos to kill the Duke at the end and thus render absolutely everything you have done and said useless, except for a slide at the end of the game. Well done, Obsidian, that is some professional RPG studio payoff. Pillars of Eternity wears the mask of consequence, but it is very visible that everything leads towards a very straight line, and that wouldn't be such a bad thing if they didn't wear the mask and were honest about it. It also wouldn't be such a bad thing if the encounter writing wasn't so average at best and subpar at worst. There were so many badly written encounters in this game, I just find it inexcusable in 2015 from Obsidian. I wanted to like this game, but I can't get over stuff like this, for example. At one point you have to infiltrate one of the cells of the Bat Cult, and you do this by giving some stupid answer at the front gate. I look like I belong here, being my personal nonsensical favorite. Then you grill an initiate for information where you just brush off suspicion by saying don't worry, and it all ends with you pretending you are a member of the cult, gaining sensitive information and then proceeding to ask people, what is this place anyway? Apparently you're impersonating cultists with some serious attention deficit disorder. I've seen James Bond movies with more believable infiltration plots. I guess one of the other things really worth mentioning is the Hollowborn Plague. It tries to give the setting a much more gritty appearance, but in reality it is just dressing. Everyone and their mother noticed the tree at the beginning of the game that was filled with hanged corpses and thought that this would set the tone for the rest of the game. But outside of that tree and one other instance, the world looks fine. No, scratch that. The world looks beautiful, and that doesn't really fit with this supposed dark tone. And it's almost like game reviewers don't finish the games they talk about. The villages have this nice rustic feel to them, nature is mostly vibrant with lovely little effects all over the place, and the big city is quite serene by medieval standards. Compare this to the previously mentioned original Neverwinter Nights campaign, which isn't in any way a pillar of storytelling, but at least they got the environment right. Guards burning corpses in the street, desperate beggars everywhere, prostitutes trying to make some coin before they die, etc. Pillars of Eternity, on the other hand, has 2 refugees in front of the Duke's palace to signify the massive amount of people trying to escape the Hollowborn Plague. In many ways, I consider environmental storytelling more important than narrative storytelling, and it is a shame, but this game just doesn't communicate its intended grittiness in the right ways. An epidemic of stillbirths can completely turn a society on its head, and while the game doesn't give an exact figure, some places mention they haven't seen a newborn in 15 years. Children of Men touches on this subject, and while it is modern, you can still see the urban decay this causes. It looks almost post-apocalyptic. Or if you want a more realistic and contemporary example, Japan is suffering from a low birth rate right now, and the issue of immigration to support a growing elderly population is continually debated there. Or you could address something psychological like the reborn movement, where women, most of which have suffered miscarriages and such, buy realistic baby dolls and treat them like the real thing. My point is that Obsidian tackled this interesting subject only in the most superficial of ways. Most of the major plot points are resolved by visiting the ruins of an ancient civilization and battling monsters there, which is as close to generic fantasy as you can get. Pillars of Eternity isn't about interesting characters, interesting worlds, or interesting events. It is about roaming around the countryside with your merry band of bland companions and reading seemingly endless streams of descriptive text. And speaking of companions, they take heavily from Baldur's Gate 1 style of writing, which is basically not a lot. All of them are meet and greet, have some dialogue options that you only need to go through once, most of them are more lore dumps about where the characters are from anyway, and a personal quest. The issue is that your companions, with 2 exceptions, already pretty much have their personalities fully defined before they meet you. They can't grow on you because they don't grow in any way or offer any insight about them further down along the line. They are pretty much the same person with the same knowledge and behavior from start to finish, which might make them functional but not interesting. So to mention the exceptions, Durance and Grieving Mother, which are written by Chris Avellone, the guy responsible for Planescape Torment, and thus he wrote the only interesting people in the entire game. They are flawed, they are secretive, and they change throughout the story in a meaningful way. I sort of think Avellone did all he could in the Baldur's Gate 1 companion frame, though I will say that I'm starting to think that this writer has a thing for psychologically damaged women. Like, he's really good at writing them. Chris, my friend, I recommend you play the Cat Lady. I am almost 100% sure it is your sort of thing. Whole lot of brutalized female characters in that game. But anyway, jokes aside, there really isn't much else to say about companions. They're just there. I couldn't even call them annoying or bad, and maybe that is much worse than being negative by traditional standards. I know people will hide behind the retro style defense, but I believe the lackluster companions was one of the more commonly acknowledged weaknesses of the original Baldur's Gate, one that was fixed with the sequel. Thus, I don't see why Obsidian should get a free pass to write weak companion characters. After all, you're going to be spending most of your time with them. And now, after all that was said, it's time to get to the nitty-gritty mechanical parts of the game, namely the combat systems. There are so many problems that have been identified, analyzed, and then over-analyzed since the last game in this engine was released, and so many of them make a return in this spiritual successor. But let us start from the beginning. First, you select your race, class, and background. Your character is defined by attributes which affect such things like health points, action speed, defense, etc. While the things you do during combat is defined by your class. The classes are the basic Dungeons and Dragons starters, with the minor caveats that bards are now called chanters, and ciphers are the equivalent of psionics, which usually don't see play in the core rulebooks. So far so generic, but the main thing to note here is the design vision. If you follow the Western RPG zeitgeist with any amount of interest, you should know who the main game designer, Josh Sawyer, is, and if you don't, he has plenty of videos up on YouTube preaching about how important balance is. For you see, the Lord Sawyer has cometh to show us the one true way to achieve balance in video games, and possibly world peace along the way. Basically, Mr. Sawyer's stance is that players should have a plethora of choices, but no ultimately bad choices. The game should accommodate any playstyle and not force the player into singular ways to build classes. Essentially, you would either have the best character or just a good character. And up to a certain point, I agree with him. I, for one, do not like the concept of dumb stats. For those of you who don't know, in most D&D style RPGs, different classes have different attributes that they value, and this leads to players always sacrificing stats they don't need, such as, for example, fighters always sacrificing charisma to both strength or constitution. Pillars of Eternity tries to alleviate this issue by casting a wider net when it comes to how attributes interact with the classes. Rogues in this game, for example, can be strong single target damage dealers, or they can also focus on their intelligence stat, which affects duration since they have a lot of debuff skills. Now, the implementation isn't perfect since perception seems to be a dumb stat for almost all classes, but beyond that, there is a fundamental problem with this style of design. It leads to MMORPG levels of class homogenization. There are essentially only 3 classes in this game: damage sponge, range damage, and support, with a melee damage dealer being mostly subpar. Rogues are the only exception. The 2 main issues that cause this homogenization, beyond the class design, are the inverse relation between damage reduction and attack speed, which is decided by your armor, and the fact that the combat is instant in encounters. The armor thing first. Arguably, the most important decision for itemization is what you will wear in your chest slot. The better your protection is, the slower you are to act, but the issue is the way damage reduction affects how much you are hurt for. You either go all the way in or you don't. Characters don't have that much endurance, so getting knocked out from 4 blows instead of 3 doesn't really change anything. But if you invest in a heavy armor, you can easily withstand entire hordes wailing on you, the paladin and the warrior being the best classes to tank. This is why melee damage classes are subpar. They need to split their stats between surviving and dealing damage, while anyone doing damage from afar can just focus on that. Take the example of the barbarian. It is meant to be a high health frontline offensive class with some splash damage, but try to get him in a brawl without proper armor and he dies immediately, but giving him proper armor results in his attacks coming so rare, he is largely ineffectual in comparison to a mage or ranger who can afford to be essentially naked. This line of design logically goes towards having one tank in the front and the rest of your characters behind him, either attacking or providing support, wearing robes or nothing at all. Almost every single encounter in this game is what is commonly known as a tank and spank, and I've watched multiple playthroughs and streams while writing this up. Most of the players on harder modes naturally gravitate towards this. I will admit though that the majority of the complexity of the combat system is lost when playing on easy or normal. It is essentially a slower paced hack and slash at that point, which really isn't a compliment. As for the encounter issue, most class abilities can only be activated in combat because that is when an encounter starts by the game's definition. With the exception of setting a trap or firing off a spell, there is little else you can do before the fighting starts, because this encounter only use design severely hampers how you can start a fight. This presupposes that all characters start on one side of the screen and the enemies on the other. They enter each other's line of sight and then rush towards one another. Say I wanted to create an encounter where you have an open room connected to a hallway. At the end of the hallway is a button which harms the enemies in the room in some fashion, like say releasing poison. If one of my characters had a high enough stealth skill, he could move unseen in front of the open room and activate said button. But the way abilities work only when encounters start and the obvious pack-like AI severely hampers such design. Most of the interesting encounters in Baldur's Gate 2 probably can't even be reproduced in Pillars of Eternity. This game promotes just rushing into one another, so obviously the gameplay devolves into tank and spank. I should also note that this means that buffs cannot be cast before a battle, meaning that it is much more advantageous to start a fight with massive damage bursts, since why would you spend time buffing instead of killing? This further helps encounter devolve into that awful tank and spank design. And since we're talking about encounters, I should mention their general design or lack thereof. The abysmal AI simply has no tactical sense. It just rushes towards your nearest character and then pulls around him, and only after completely surrounding that character do they go to the next one. Sometimes. This leads to the obvious tactic of creating choke points that allow you to gun down the enemies on the other side with the greatest of ease. And a lot of encounters can be done like this. A lot. I mean a lot as in almost all of them. Combine this with the fact that this game has an engagement rule that says that a character gets hit immediately if he moves away from an enemy, and things get real static real quick. I also dislike the engagement system because it is made to forcefully limit the player. I can't even remember if an enemy ever moved away so they would get hit by this rule. Systems that apply to both AI and the player but only ever happen to one due to the way that the content is structured is just plain bad design. They might as well have had Josh Sawyer's head appear and sing every time you get hit by disengaging. And with the exception of a few boss fights later in the game, there really isn't that much to say about the actual depth of combat, no matter how complex the character creation might appear to be. You can see how little foresight Obsidian had even when over-designing things like the shade creatures, which have a summon, instant teleportation, and a high damage spell, but you encounter them in the first few hours, which make the latter creatures seem underwhelming by comparison. Or you could take the example of the entire priest class, which has like 3 dozen spells, and you'll continuously scratch your head trying to use something beyond the occasional healing, because they just mostly have minor buffs. Having 100 situational abilities is useless if there is an evident win-all strategy achieved with minimal effort. Pillars of Eternity took the basic components from all games, such as vast amounts of spells, without actually thinking how this fits into the experience properly. More so, they most likely exacerbated many of the problems that were in the original games. Druids are by far the best damage dealer magic class, and Ciphers are by far the best crowd controllers, while Mages are somewhere in between and thus immediately bad by comparison, and the Priests being just mostly useless because buffs are pretty underwhelming. And for that matter, debuffs suffer from that too. During the end of the game, I checked the journal for an explanation of various effects, and I said, wow, so many things can happen and have happened, but almost none of them are noticeable, with the exception of the obvious stun that makes it unable for you to control your character, or charm which turns your characters against you. Pillars uses this MMO style of design of -10 or +10% something for 10 seconds. Here is a little game design pro tip. If you have status effects, either positive or negative, have people play the game without any indication for them during testing. If the player feels something is wrong, then the effect is meaningful. If not, go back to the drawing board. The UI indication should help the player that wants information, not be the only sign that something is happening. And this extends to the talents as well. There are so many that just add minor percentile values here and there. In fact, with the exception of some of the class-specific ones, this is all they do. But coming back to the classes, the issue isn't that they are unbalanced, but the fact that they have so many interactions and abilities that overlap. Dungeons & Dragons classes have never been balanced, but wizards, bards, druids, clerics, etc. had so many situational uses that it was hard to quantify them. Pillars, on the other hand, partly because of encounter design and partly because of homogenized class design, makes it painfully clear who does what better in terms of damage or crowd control. And you know what? Balance is to game design what the unified field theory is to physics. Stretch comparison aside, what I mean is that it is important to have a goal, but the journey is arguably more important and can offer more discoveries. I think a lot of game designers have this vision of a system and abstract balance, but a balanced experience is what players are looking for, in the sense that their choices are validated but at the same time challenged. This is the balance of balance, if you will. To show you exactly what I'm talking about, here's my favorite example of balance, the board game Cosmic Encounter. In that game, each player is given control of a race with a specific ability and they must conquer the galaxy. The trick is that during each turn, alliances can be made and broken, and this is far more important than the strength of your abilities. And thus the game has races with clearly superior powers to other races, but this means that the weak guys band together while the strong guy remains alone. It is a very clever system that immediately balances out while still giving players vastly different experiences and powers each game. This way, the race that the player gets is validated but challenged at the same time, no matter how strong or weak they are. In terms of video games, you can have products like Pillars which do validate but rarely challenge, thus creating monotony, or products like Daggerfall which does challenge but it can miss the validation part. Seriously, you can make the game stupidly hard with non-optimized builds, which leads to frustration. But what really killed me the most about this game is the utter and complete lack of innovation and willingness to experiment. Does the game have good parts? Yes. Does it have highlights? Yes. But they are not Obsidian's achievements. Almost every single thing I liked in this game were taken from other Infinity Engine games in one form or another. It is hard to give credit for copying something that is 17 years old. The only thing that I see the potential in is the choose your own adventure style transitions for encounters and obstacles. I do realize this is done with budget in mind, but if they would have added more options rather than just use one skill or one consumable, it might have been something that breathed a bit of life into this sterile game. And by the way, the things that are changed or reiterated slightly from the Infinity Engine games immediately have something that annoys me greatly. For example, characters have a set amount of endurance during each battle, and when it reaches 0, they are knocked out. Thus, characters eventually need to rest to replenish their abilities and health, but resting supplies are limited, so the player needs to manage his resources, or he would if he couldn't just backtrack to the nearest inn and rest. I get that they're trying to solve the rest everywhere problem that plagues a lot of D&D inspired games, but this doesn't fix anything, it just adds tedium. Also, Obsidian took the fatigue system from the previously mentioned games, which imposes penalties on your characters after some time, which leads to situations where you must rest due to the harsh effects, even though say you wanted to impose limits on yourself and see how far you could go by conserving health and using abilities correctly. And I am aware that the athletic skill drastically cuts fatigue gain to the point of never seeing it again, but two wrongs don't make a right in game design. You can and usually have multiple mistakes hidden behind a single mistake closer to the surface. And speaking of skills, it is amazing how useless they are. I guarantee that the people who finished this game started throwing points around willy-nilly by the end. Beyond one character with mechanics to pick locks and to detect traps, plus getting 3 athletics on everybody to ignore the fatigue system, you might as well ignore skills. Lore gives you access to spell scrolls, which have mostly low-level spells which are rendered useless by the abundance of magic users from the very beginning. Survival increases the duration of food benefits, which seems pointless because food is essentially pre-buffs, and you only use them when you need them. Rushing through encounters to maintain buffs is highly anti-Infinity Engine game design. And finally you have stealth, for which I don't recall a single encounter where sneaking by the enemy gives you an advantage in the fight, and you can easily scout out the next enemy encounter composition with a 0 stealth character, if that was its purpose. And on top of all of these issues, you can also add lackluster itemization. I'm glad you have unlimited inventory because I hate inventory limits with a passion, except in survival games. But the actual effects on items are far from interesting. You have a wide variety of items with different attack speeds that overcome different resistances, which would be quite fun to use if there was any encounter design. But the actual special magical effects are just plain statistical changes. Convert 10% of grazes into hits, yay, or increase critical damage, whoopee. There isn't a single item in this game that has some special effect that might actually change your playstyle a little. Even the legendary ones are bland statistical changes. Not to mention that most of the excitement of finding items is taken out by a very straightforward crafting system which can carry you through most of the game. Obsidian should have decided if they wanted items obtained through exploration or crafting be the base of progression regarding equipment. Instead, they went with this middle of the road approach with no highlights. Very Sawyeristic, sadly. Look, I paid full price on day one for this game. I genuinely wanted to like it. If not for Obsidian's Kickstarter triumph, then at least getting my money's worth. But I cannot get over the plethora of problems, from almost non-existent encounter design to boring class design to nonsensical narrative design. Honestly, the only highlight that remains with me 4 months on is the Adra dragon fight at the bottom of Cain Nua on the Path of the Damned difficulty. It is a pretty cheesy encounter by virtue of AoE insta-kills and continuous stuns, but hey, at least I was challenged in some way to think about what I was doing. It is just too bad that it is at the bottom of the mega dungeon, read boring dungeon. You see, one of the Kickstarter stretch goals was the creation of a 15-level expertly crafted dungeon which had its own story. What was actually achieved was around 13 levels of encounters copy-pasted over and over again, barely any dialogue, barely any puzzles. Such a dungeon begged for a non-combat pure puzzle level, with the only worthwhile bits being in the last 2 levels, which are small arenas for the last 2 boss encounters, which both can be bypassed through dialogue if you want. But I don't know, at least I like the visual interface of the dungeon, which showed the entire thing was a construction site around an Adra giant that looked cool if meaningless in the grand scheme of things. Speaking of Kickstarter, it is so cringe-worthy to see the backer dialogue. People who pledged above a certain amount could write something on gravestones or have special NPCs with small stories written by them. Thank God for the fact that they have golden names, because it is a blessing to be able to so easily ignore them. Money well spent. spent, what can I say? A few of them are okay, but most of them are just overwritten or Tumblr tier fanfiction. I foresee a mod to remove them in the future, or maybe an option in future expansions. And I won't even dignify the tacked on effort that was the Stronghold with a full critical opinion. What taxes, what patrols, and who are you even a vassal to for such a thing to make sense? Or are you someone's sovereign? Did the people working on this even have the slightest idea how feudalism works? You could literally take this part of the game, remove it, and the experience would be unchanged. That's how insignificant it is. But now for the last and most important question. Is Pillars of Eternity a good game? I fundamentally believe Pillars of Eternity wasn't conceived as a game at its core, but as a product. And you can see this in the way the people at Obsidian talk about their experience working on this project in the documentary Road to Eternity, which describes how the whole thing went down. I don't think those in charge of making this game even liked the idea of trying to make something Infinity Engine related, but Obsidian wanted to reorient itself after years of trying to hassle with publishers, and they wanted to choose the most nostalgia-laden style of RPG with which they could get Kickstarter funds. And they succeeded. Pillars sold well and it was well received by critics, so props to them for achieving their goals, though this wouldn't be the first game that had both those qualities which I heavily disliked. This middle-of-the-road design, where you can't really mess up in any significant way, was made to make the Infinity Engine formula as digestible as possible, not actually improve on it in any significant way, thus this is just smoothing out the edges and in no case evolution. Not to mention that this type of design leads to no highlights due to artificially trying to cancel out the low parts of the game. I can't believe I'm saying this, but Pillars of Eternity is the most boring and unambitious thing ever made by Obsidian. The only good parts being taken wholesale from the games they were trying to honor, and from my point of view, this makes it my least favorite Obsidian game. In conclusion, this game was advertised on Kickstarter as a passion project take on the beloved Infinity Engine formula, and what we got was a Baldur's Gate 1 clone whose greatest achievement was quality of life features. A good baby's first CRPG, but far below what one would expect from Obsidian when given full creative control. And it is just hard to stomach when you compare it to Divinity Original Sin, until now the biggest CRPG Kickstarter, since you can see the amount of passion that went into it. The studio behind Divinity, Larian, said they wanted to make this game for like 15 years, which is something that you can clearly see when playing it, and I greatly appreciate them for that. I wanted Obsidian to be able to make their own dream game with crowdfunding. Sadly, it is very clear that wasn't their intention. I will wrap this up by saying that I'm starting to detest the way the monetization system of Kickstarter warps developers. While there were two excellent RPGs made this way that I liked very much, it is very sad to see that two high-profile hitters were such utter disappointments. Here's hoping Torment Tides of Numenera, the next big Kickstarter thing, will finally create that modern CRPG masterpiece we're all waiting for. And here's also hoping that Obsidian will find its creative guts and brains again. Though given that Chris Avellone left recently and that the things shown in the White March expansion trailer seem pretty lackluster in tackling the major issues of this title, hope seems ever more hopeless.